Welcome to Growing E-commerce. I'm your host, Mike Ryan of Smarter E-commerce. Today, I'm joined by Alex Greifeld. Alex has a long background in e-commerce, and until recently, she was at Tapestry, which collects brands you'll know from the luxury space, like Coach and Kate Spade. Now she's acting as an e-commerce growth advisor, so she's a really perfect fit for this podcast. We talk through age-old debates like retention versus acquisition, and newer ones like return on ad spend versus marketing efficiency ratio, lifetime value versus first order profit. If those oppositions sound a bit binary, black and white, either or, well, Alex is about as undogmatic as they come. Her motto is no best practices. So listen to find out why she says that and to hear nuanced opinions on all of the above. All right, let's get into it. So, Alex, thanks so much for joining us. Why don't you tell us about yourself? What are your skills? What themes interest you?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So my name's Alex Greifeld. I'm an e-commerce growth consultant. I've been in the industry more than 10 years, but I started my career as a women's wear designer. I made mom jeans for a living. From there, I kind of transitioned into the digital marketing and e-commerce world. And I've worked at companies all the way from bootstrapped brands that had never taken outside funding all the way up to global Fortune 500 brands. So a breadth of experience. And what really interests me about e-commerce and digital marketing is probably the human factor, because it's a combination of basically like human psychology and rapid iteration and learning, which I find really interesting. But what I'm probably most well known for is my blog and newsletter, No Best Practices. And that's, I guess, another aspect of my career is I've seen a lot of people do a lot of things that don't actually work, but everyone says that they do. So my newsletter and blog are about digging into that and understanding the business from a first principles perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, you anticipated one of my next questions. I mean, how could I possibly have you on and not ask about no best practices? But before we dig into that a little more, I didn't know that I didn't recognize that you had this background as a designer as well. I mean, that must be so valuable because then I guess you come at things with a real product awareness as well, and not just, just the channel awareness or audience awareness or stuff like that. Do you see advantages from that kind of background?
Yeah, I think it's helped me a tremendous amount in my career because sometimes, well, I would say that product is the forgotten P of marketing, especially nowadays. And sometimes the only way that you can really explain what's going on with your digital marketing performance is to dig into product and product performance. No one else that I've encountered has really done that a whole bunch. So it's really kind of the cornerstone of my consulting practice is getting that holistic view of how products, customers, and channels interact.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. I think product is just super important. And I mean, then let's dig into this no best practices thing for a second here. So, I mean, you mentioned that there's a lot of kind of bad advice and people follow it anyway. I mean, why is that? You think it just gets this kind of momentum or something like that?
I don't think there's necessarily a ton of blanket bad advice out there, but what does happen is that people read advice, they see it associated with a company that's seen a lot of success, but then they don't take a step back and really think, is that company in the same world as my company? Is this advice actually applicable to my situation? They just think that because this company went public or because this company had a big exit and they happen to do this thing that must be directly correlated with their success. So I think that's where a lot of the best practices mentality comes from.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I mean, people share what they know and what's worked for them, but then you need to kind of, if you're looking at that, you need to abstract that a bit and not just take it too literally. Otherwise, it's kind of like a cargo cult, like just because somebody did it, or kind of a ritual, like it's supposed to work by magic. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll be honest, I think a lot of marketers don't actually know, if they've run 10 different tactics and revenues went up, they don't know which one of those tactics, if any of them, directly contributed to that revenue increase. Because when we're in a bull market or when things are generally going well and a brand is really hot, you can do almost anything and the sales will continue to go up. So
Yeah.
I think we just need more introspection in general.
Yeah. Yeah, totally right. And just because that worked doesn't mean that there wasn't some kind of counterfactual or what if scenario that wouldn't have worked better. You might have just reached kind of a local maximum and thought, wow, that was great, but there was some other opportunity out there that you don't know about. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think totally people are not always really, we're all too happy to kind of pat ourselves on the back when things go well and say, well, that's not my fault when things don't go well. It's kind of human nature,
Hmm.
and not really getting into kind of the root causes. You mentioned first principles earlier, in terms of the way you approach no best practices. So could you give us an example of like what is a first principle for you, or how have you applied a first principle in an e-commerce or marketing setting?
Yeah, I think a big part of that for me is understanding how customers generally behave.
Mm,
There are some commonalities in customer behavior in the customer life cycle that I've seen for every single company that I've analyzed throughout my career. One of the big ones is what a customer's first order is a really good indicator of what they're interested in and what they're willing to pay for your product. So you're not going to bring people in using a heavy promotion and then get them to come back and buy from you at full price later. Like
mm,
that's one of the biggest misconceptions that I've seen pop up again and again at different companies I've worked for. And it just doesn't happen. Like if someone is going to spend $10 on your product at a 50% markdown, they're not going to come back and buy it for 20 at full. Another big one is loyalty and when loyalty happens and like what is the meaning of loyalty. I personally define loyalty as the point where a customer is more than 50% likely to come back and buy from you again. And that typically happens for most brands by the time a customer reaches between their third and their fifth purchase. It
mhm,
varies from brand to brand, but that's usually the sweet spot. And brands, I think they overinvest in engaging their loyal customers because if you've reached that point, you're really likely to come back no matter what I do. So trying to hyper engage them is almost a waste of time compared to
mm,
other things that you might be doing. And then they overestimate the number of people who actually are loyal. Like for most brands, between maybe 10 to 15% of your last 12-month buyers are people who have made at least like 4 or 5 purchases. So even though it's a really big spending audience, it's a really small audience.
and then to your point, like let's say that of that 10 to 15% who's there, as kind of a rule of thumb, it might only be that you'll be lucky if about half of them or more, that then maybe you're seeing that more than half of that percentage will really be loyal. They still might just be kind of dabbling with the brand or not that loyal, right?
Well, I think of it this way. You really have to like a brand. And again, all of this that I've just said, it holds true for mono brand e-commerce. If you're selling, like if you're a department store or something selling multiple categories, it's a bit different because
Mm,
breadth of selection kind of breaks down some of these patterns that I'm talking about. But if you're a mono brand, especially if you're selling a limited assortment, someone really has to like you to buy from you 4 or 5 times.
mm,
Because even if you think about your first purchase, it's like you often forget that you've purchased from these brands, until the package comes in the mail. It's like very hard to be memorable. And I
yeah,
mean, that's great. It feels like someone gave you a gift, even though it was
yeah.
just you. Um,
It's like, oh,
but
I missed a package. I ordered something. What? Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So it's hard to be memorable. It's hard to get from purchase one to purchase two.
Mhm.
If someone's reached purchase 4 or 5, they're really bought in, and they've started to associate your brand with the category. So if you're selling socks, when they're like in their mind, I could use a pair of new socks, they're probably saying, I'm going to this brand's website. So when you get to that stage, it's really hard. And for most brands, out of every 100 new customers they acquire, between 1 and 10 will ever make it to the loyalty phase. But
Mhm.
once you're there, you really have to screw things up to get someone out of that phase. Or, there's natural attrition as well. Like people's tastes and life change, and that may also shift them out of the loyalty zone. But
Mhm.
marketing almost matters less.
Okay.
Although, on the flip side of that, if you do send campaigns to that audience and you measure them on a last click point basis, they always look like they're performing really well, because
Yeah.
that audience is going to, like, they're naturally your most engaged audience.
Yeah, exactly. But you're not really doing something incremental for the business there. So, I mean, if we take what you've talked about there and then kind of look at some, you were saying that people are maybe over investing on engaging already loyal segments, and, it feels like this maybe can't be influenced that much or doesn't need to be influenced that much. Like, where do we stand with whole big fields of marketing like retention marketing, or these kind of, I just recorded the episode before this about customer lifetime value, or LTV. How do you view topics like that then through this lens?
So I think retention is incredibly important, but it's one of the most misunderstood and mismeasured and mismanaged fields in marketing, because what retention marketing means in a lot of organizations is email and SMS. And it's like, what our retention team is like, okay, we're sending 14 emails a week, and we're just managing like the sheer operational load of doing that. And there isn't, it's like someone purchases, and whether it's their first purchase or their 12th purchase, they're getting pretty much the same email or the same SMS message. Like, the big missed opportunity in retention marketing is to break the customer's journey into distinct stages and market to people based on their stage. And it's something that's talked about a lot. Like, customer journeys get a ton of airtime because people use it to try to sell software to e-commerce brands. But from what I've seen, even being personally exposed to some of that, like, customer journey centric thought leadership, it's like, they don't think of things in terms of a life cycle. It's every customer, no matter what they bought when they came into the business or how many orders they placed with you, it's like it's like a welcome message, a win back message, an upsell message. And retention, I think, the other big missed opportunity is retention marketers think about channels, and they think about promos, and they think about like message volume and timing, but they rarely think about copy or creative. And I think in a lot of cases, it's probably due to the challenge of getting the volume of creative required, but it's a huge missed opportunity, because if you're batch and blasting people 7 days a week, and you're like, okay, we're going to launch a welcome or a post-purchase journey, one incremental email with the same kind of like milk toast boilerplate copy,
Yeah.
it's not going to do anything. It's like, creative does have to be part of the equation.
So there could be a case here for kind of, less is more, or focusing on the qualitative characteristic of that as well. So you mentioned just a second ago, customer journey getting hyped because MarTech, because vendors, software vendors, stuff like this. So this just reminds me, because your last role, if we just jump back on your career for a second, you've worked in luxury fashion more or less for quite a while. And in your last role at Tapestry, if I'm not mistaken, that was a role called Director of Marketing Capabilities and Technology. So what did that role entail? What does a role like that do? What kind of a week in the life look like?
Probably sitting on Zoom for 10 hours a day, but in
So super
reality,
glamorous then.
yeah. So the thing to understand about Tapestry that's a little bit different from potentially other organizations is it's a It's a roll up of three brands. It's a conglomerate, and it was relatively recently formed. So they had built out internal shared capabilities around a lot of ops stuff like IT and HR and whatnot. But my team shared capabilities around marketing and some other facets of the digital world. Um, it's not it's not necessarily like a position or a way of structuring the org that might exist at Monobrands, because I don't know if there's necessarily a need for it. But what I was primarily focused on was doing the implementation of the company's first customer data platform for all three brands, and then using that software to help the different brand marketing teams understand their customers better and make their marketing more effective. And a big part of that was test and learn and helping to implement some structure around testing, because a lot of the testing, it was either it wasn't being done in a consistently statistically sound way, or it wasn't laddering up to conclusions. It was like, let's test subject lines this week, and let's test the design of our email hero image. So helping the brands get more value out of their testing, essentially.
Yeah, I like that idea of laddering up the test team, that there's kind of, just having a roadmap in place, understanding what things we want to test and why, what is the right sequencing for that, how many tests can we have going at the same time, how might these tests conflict with each other or totally mess each other up, because I think that's something that happens sometimes too.
Yeah, I guess something I see a lot on Twitter is just the rallying cry to test, 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 and roll out 10 new creatives in paid social every week, and all of this around like testing and data driven marketing. But it's really hard to run a statistically sound test, especially if you're a small brand, because you don't have enough traffic or enough ad spend.
Yeah.
So being intentional about what you're testing is really important. And that starts honestly with customer research. Like, you need hypotheses that are grounded in an understanding of the customer. Otherwise, you're just kind of throwing things against the wall. And when you do find something that works, it's like you don't actually know why it works. So eventually it will stop working. Like every tactic eventually does kind of stop working. And then you don't know what to do from there.
Yeah, definitely. So the importance of research and ideation there too. Let's see here. Something else I want to pick your brain about. I've talked about this on the podcast before and with some guests, but I'd love to hear your take on it. You're not a big return on ad spend fan, not a big ROAS fan. So tell us about that. Where does it fall short? Why does it remain so popular? What else is there? What's the alternative?
So I think the reason that ROAS is so popular, especially last click GA ROAS, is because it's like plug and play, and it always ladders up to a consistent revenue number. Like, it's a way to take your daily revenue number and truly break it down by channel in a way that's easy for people across the organization to digest. And where I see ROAS really getting some companies into trouble is finance will use ROAS as their budgeting mechanism. So they'll do something where it's like, okay, this year your digital marketing budget is 10% of your revenue target, which, by the way, is like way too small for any business to grow. But I'm using 10% because it's a nice, easy number. So the marketing and the finance teams will get together and be like, okay, all of our digital advertising activities have to have a blended ROAS of 10. Or they might say, okay, we think half of our revenue will come in organically, so it needs to have a blended ROAS of 5. And then all of these different marketing channels and campaigns will be evaluated on whether they're able to hit a ROAS of 5, which, as we know in today's environment, is like almost nothing you're doing is going to be hitting a ROAS goal like that, unless you're running a crazy, promotional event. So what happens is, your ROAS is always higher when you're on sale. So you'll plan more of your budget and more of your growth into those periods when you're on sale. And then, as we touched on earlier, those customers don't come back and buy at full price. So you run the
Yeah.
business like that for 1 or 2 years, and you're in a situation where it's impossible to sell anything at full price. And so, depending on what your margin structure is and what your long term goals for the business are, that can become you can get kind of trapped in this dangerous cycle, this like downwards, or actually, you know what I call it, the flywheel of doom,
Yeah.
where you're just building and building this markdown business over time, and there's no way out of it.
Yeah, you're just acquiring the wrong kind of customer over and over again. Or even they could have been the right kind of customer, but you've just set a different expectation. Now you're training them to expect discounts from you or wait for discounts from you. But what about alternatives? Is there like another way forward that you would recommend?
So I think it depends on the scale and complexity of the business. If you only have one major digital acquisition channel, like Facebook ads is the big one for a lot of brands,
Hmm.
you can use kind of as your most, I guess, as your North Star, the ratio of total daily ad spend to total daily revenue and then to total daily new customer revenue. So MER and AMER.
Yeah.
MER, for anyone has not heard MER before, it's MER, marketing efficiency ratio. I hate when people just jump into acronyms with no explanation, but that's
Yeah.
what those are. And you want to set targets around for your MER and AMER based on the economics of your business. Like, what do you need to do from an cost of acquisition perspective to either break it even or be profitable? And so, I still occasionally use Facebook in platform metrics as like a signal of how well the campaign is generally performing. I don't go in there every day and be like, oh no, we got 5 conversions yesterday and only 2 today. Like, let's shut this campaign off. But it's on a longer time horizon, it can still be used as a signal. Yeah, you can use it as a signal of general campaign performance. I'd say like 85% of the time. I think there's sometimes when there's just these macro delays in data ingestion within Facebook. So you can't lean on that anymore.
Mm.
And then I use Google Analytics just for measures of traffic quality, like time on site and bounce rate, because um, that's how you can tell if the audience that you're sending to the site is generally relevant.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I think just first off, and especially, also depends on what kind of like volume business you're doing and so on, but there's just a certain amount of normal variation or noise in your campaigns, and sometimes people are like holding their breath and or jumping at shadows or whatever. And particularly, I'm not as deep into Facebook, but from what I understand, just the volatility is increasing, and they just seem to be, there's a lot of reasons why, but the like you said, there seem to be delays in the way information gets batched or sent to the platform and stuff like that. So it's definitely a noisy environment. I mean, I guess what I find challenging about MER or MER is, I mean, I think it makes when you have a lot of your spend concentrated in a single channel, it's a little more straightforward. But then when you're dealing with like multiple channels, and let's say you've got either a more even distribution or you've just got a notable enough amount of money running through each one, that it's just hard to really get something causative out of there, because each of them in and of themselves are so complicated, and then they sum up to this aggregated thing where definitely it's like a good broad indicator of health, things going up and down. But personally, I'd always be real tempted to just to decompose that and figure out like, well, what's going on where and why. But it's a tricky balance to find there.
Yeah. And I think an important distinction to make is you need to understand which of your channels are demand drivers and which of your channels are demand capture.
Sure.
So, like, branded search to me is demand capture. That campaign, unless you're doing something outside of that campaign to cause people to search for your brand name, nothing is going to happen there. A lot of affiliate, unfortunately, is demand capture. It's, people looking for coupon codes when they're already ready to check out on your site. So really, I think there's a bit of nuance in some other channels, but understanding that is really important. Understanding the incrementality of your demand capture channels so you're not overinvested there. And then if you truly do have 2 or 3 or 4 demand generation channels running, then I think that's when a third party attribution software starts to make sense. But there are limitations there because attribution can give you a perspective on what's happening, but it won't tell you, like, if you need to make a step progression in your strategy or kind of break out of your current box to get where you need to go, it won't tell you how to do that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the point about incrementality is well taken, but yeah, these channels do play together, which maybe you'll see through a multi-touch tool or something. But because you might say Facebook, the performance is really bad. I'm going to shut that down, and then suddenly brand search collapses because actually, just like you said, like brand search was capturing the demand that actually Facebook was generating, or whatever the case might be. I definitely I see it similar. And just you had mentioned, I just wanted, before we move on from that, you mentioned AIMR, so that this is like acquisition marketing efficiency ratio. So tell us what's that and why is that important for you?
So the way I measure it is total digital marketing spend divided by total new customer revenue. And that's basically, it's a read on what percent of a first customer's order is being eaten up by marketing costs. And depending on the margin structure of your business, you don't want that to exceed a certain percent. Otherwise, you're no longer going to be profitable on the first order.
Yeah, I mean, for you, how significant is it to be then profitable on the first order rather than budgeting that you're going to be profitable on the second or third order? Is it too risky to wait on those second or third order, or it's going to depend?
So I think in the vast majority of cases for mono brand e-commerce, you need to be profitable on the first order, because I've never seen a business, even in the consumable space, like cosmetics, like I've never seen a business where more than 35 or 40 of every new 100 new customers you acquire comes back and purchases again, ever. So most mono brand e-com businesses are just heavily dependent on profitable first purchase to break even. I know there are some scenarios where people are trying to scale or get market share, and so they're willing to take a loss on the first order. But I think there are some business models that just like don't work in e-commerce in the landscape that we have today. Like if you're selling really high AUR items and you're not willing to invest enough marketing budget to kind of match those AURs and drive a certain number of conversions each day, then it's that probably doesn't work, like from a business model perspective, on e-commerce using paid social as your big acquisition driver.
I mean, this is just triggering some thoughts in my mind here, because the picture doesn't look rosier lately with e-commerce or in the broader economy. You recently wrote a newsletter or blog about how to survive a recession. So are we in a recession in the first place? And if we might be, how would you survive it? What's your advice to brands as they head into this kind of shaky environment here? Or even if we look at it as now, where we're just maybe facing tough year-on-year comps.
So I think the first part of the question, I can't tell you if we're in a recession because I'm not an economist. I know that there's another macro issue that I think has been eating away at brands' growth trajectory, which is the fact that when the COVID lockdown started, there was a huge unnatural rush of people to shop online. And so a lot of brands saw a lot of new customer acquisition that, like, frankly, they did nothing to incentivize. And so they started to see like really strong paid marketing performance because of these macro factors. And then when you got to the end of 2020, when you're in 2021, now there's kind of like a halo effect in retention that's kind of keeping the growth going. But now that we've reached 2022, it's like that's all been washed out of the system. And when you look at the trajectory of e-commerce as a percent of total U.S. retail dollars, it like spiked up and then kind of regressed to the mean growth trend where it had been pre-COVID. So that was, rather than a recession, it was brands not realizing that surge was being caused by macro factors and that it was inevitably going to end unless they did something to keep it going. That, I mean, and honestly, like that's really hard because for many of us, it was an unprecedented situation. And a lot of brands, especially smaller brands, don't really invest the level of time into like forecasting and talking through those situations that would allow them to get in front of that. So I think that's what's causing a lot of the pain that we're seeing. That being said, I think the best way to come out of the next 12 to 18 months in a positive position, the first thing to do is to be really clear with yourself about what your objectives are. Like, where do you want to be in 18 to 24 months? Are you looking to sell? Are you looking to take on outside investment? Are you looking to just run your business as your job, like as a way to pay yourself? And then align all of your strategies and your activities around that so that the narrative, when you come out of the end of the year, the narrative behind your financial results supports that goal. So if you are trying to get acquired, you want to show profitable growth. So you have to be smart about where you're investing in growth and where you're investing in, everywhere else in the business. And it would probably be good to find a growth channel outside of Facebook ads, unless your brand and your product is like really hyper engineered into that channel.
Totally. I mean, on this question of are we in a recession or not, I just want to mention, I saw this headline last week, I think, I can't remember, but it was on the New York Times, and they said basically, it read something like this: the vibes in the economy are weird right now, and they then coined the term vibe session instead of a recession. So, I mean, it was like an op-ed kind of thing. It wasn't, or a guest column or something. And it's, on the one hand, doesn't feel that serious, but then on the other hand, it is just so weird right now. It's really, you're seeing this report indicating this, the other report indicating the other thing. It feels like there's all these conflicting signals in here. But totally, the e-commerce branch was really coasting on these lockdown effects and stuff like that. And I think one thing that hasn't maybe been discussed enough yet, because we could have already seen kind of a snapback, a return to the mean, as you mentioned, in the e-commerce penetration. We could have seen that maybe already in 2021 last year, but the pandemic was extended longer than maybe people initially thought. But actually, the 2021 numbers, I was seeing some research about just the impact of inflation in there, and that there was, a lot of growth, but that a lot of it was inflationary. And then this year too, a lot of the growth, we're looking often at these nominal numbers and not the real growth numbers. And when you correct for inflation, definitely a different picture there.
Yeah. The one thing that I will say is, as much as it is important to build out kind of like an internal forecasting practice and to understand the effect of particular macro situations on your business, I think there's a flip side to that, where brands that are that I guess in comparison to the total size of their market, they're less than 1% of the market, and they get wrapped up in some of these macro questions where frankly, it's like you're going to get more value out of just hyper focusing on your customer versus, doing this like in-depth macroeconomic analysis, or, thinking about market share or thinking about your competition. It's like, you're so small that what Target is doing, unless you're carried in Target, is not necessarily going to affect you. Or like the promotions that Macy's is running, unless you're carried in Macy's, are like not going to affect you. So I think it can be almost like analysis paralysis. Like, it's very important to focusing on the things that truly do matter for you.
Yeah, that's a great point. People just tend to get so focused on competitors and what everyone else is doing. But if you just keep your head down, do the work, focus on those brilliant basics, keep the customer front and center, then that's how you'll actually be differentiated and do better than your competitors, because that's basically what it takes. But I know we've got limited time. I've kept you for a while now, so I just want to ask you before we go, what are your Q4 expectations this year? Do you have expectations? What do you think?
That's an interesting one, because on one hand, I think Q4 and holiday is incredibly overhyped.
Mm.
A lot of brands have put themselves in a position where their revenue gets like clumped into that period between Black Friday and Christmas. And part of that is due to the ROAS, the misuse of ROAS that we talked about before. And so it's like, it becomes this really like do or die period. And instead of trying to figure out ways to diversify out of that period, they're just like zeroed in on, oh no, how's the macro situation going to affect us? Like, what promo should we run? What promos are our competitors running? It's just not it's not a great way to do business. Like, I've worked for brands where holiday it just wasn't even a peak season for them. Partially due to the industry or the product they were selling, partially due to other, the way they ran the business. But I think, I don't really know if I have a prediction for like, will people be spending money? Again, it's like, I try to leave that to people with more resources and expertise than I have personally. But I think forecasting and understanding where your holiday revenue is coming from is really important, so that you can set yourself up for success. Usually the best way to have a good holiday is to acquire a lot of other customers in the 3 to 6 months leading up to holiday. Other than that, it's I actually do have a newsletter going out on Sunday. Well, it probably will have gone out already by the time this podcast airs, but I'm going to share a few other thoughts like related to merchandising, forecasting, and then also something that a lot of brands obsess over is how do we get the holiday customers to come back in January? It's like, they're not going to come back.
You don't.
Like, they're just not going to come back. So
there
are things that you can do to increase your baseline percentage, but like most of them aren't coming back. So it's all about, when you're thinking about, I guess it's a good way to kind of sum up my whole philosophy is, where you put your energy determines the future trajectory of your business. So be smart about where you're investing your energy.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it makes perfect sense what you've said, because, this ROAS bias will tend, then you're going to see it's going to tend to drive you into this cycle of discounting, driving up conversion rates, and saying, oh, this is working. But I really like that that kind of statement you made, that if you're waiting on the peak to kind of capture demand or make ends meet, then you're too late, because the people that you're going to catch in that time, there tends to be just, there's a risk that it's just purely transactional, purely discount based. You're just consolidating demand into a high discount, high competition period, and that can be pretty ugly. So yeah, I agree with you. I'm not a huge fan of Black Friday, and I feel bad because we've inflicted it on the rest of the world at this point. Like, here I am based in Europe, and Black Friday is a huge sales event here as well. And it's just interesting how it's happened. But I agree that the economics of it are not that pretty. Well, before we let you go, then I just want to ask: is there any other like messages you want to leave us with, or is there anything that you want to plug or promote? Where can we find you?
Yeah, so I'll definitely plug my newsletter.
Yeah.
You can sign up at knowbestpractices.co. That's co, not .com, and it goes out twice a month. I save all of my best comments and insights for the newsletter, so definitely sign up. Yeah. And you can also find me on Twitter at Hey It's Alex P, as in Peter. I got that handle before I was married,
That's why it's not, hey, it's Alex G. That was
Mhm.
taken by the time I changed my name.
It's-
But I love to chat about this stuff with people on Twitter. So if you're on Twitter, find me there.
Yeah, and as a newsletter subscriber, I can definitely endorse that No Best Practices newsletter. It's really great. I get some newsletters in my inbox, but that's one that I'm always sure to read.
Oh, thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
I was blown away when I first I think I stumbled across you on Twitter, and I discovered your website where you have some past newsletters archived there, and I felt like I found this treasure trove, and I was like, wow, where has this been hiding this whole time? I can't believe I missed this. So I really love all that content that you're putting out. Really have to say thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Then thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate that.
All right.
Thanks for listening to Growing E-commerce. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please consider sharing it with coworkers, friends, or within your professional network. We really appreciate it. This podcast is produced by Smarter E-commerce, also known as SMEC. To learn more, visit smarter-ecommerce.com.